We will now begin with the main session for the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. The first speaker is Mr. Allistair Ritchie, Director of Asia Society Policy Institute. Everyone, please welcome him onto the stage with a big round of applause. Mr. Allistair Ritchie is an international expert in greenhouse gas emissions trading systems, and his presentation today is titled The EU ETS and its Role in Achieving Carbon Neutrality in the EU.
안녕하세요. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great honor to be invited to speak at the 13th International Greenhouse Gas Conference. Thank you very much to GIR for the invitation to speak. And in my presentation this afternoon, I will be sharing the latest developments of the EU emissions trading system. This is important because these developments can provide some good lessons for Korea and for other jurisdictions that have either already implemented or planning to implement this type of policy. As you're probably familiar, the EU has adopted a 55% GHG reduction target by 2030 to be on the pathway to net zero, the Fit for 55 package. And in line with the Fit for 55 package, many EU policies have been revised, including the EU ETS. So, in my presentation, I'll be firstly talking about the impacts so far of this policy. Then I'll be highlighting some of the key revisions as a result of the Fit for 55 package. And then finally, I will present some lessons for other countries that are implementing emissions trading systems. Firstly, the key message is that the EU ETS is effective in driving GHG emission reductions cost effectively. There's been about 35% reduction in emissions between 2005 and 2019. Most interestingly, in 2019, the Market Stability Reserve was introduced to sort out some long-term problems of over-allocation and oversupply of allowances in the market. And once that had been implemented, it really did transform the policy, and it transformed the emissions reductions. So in 2019, there was a 9% reduction just in 1 year alone. And then in 2020, there was a 13% reduction. So in this chart, you can see the red line is the verified emissions with a sharper drop in the last few years, and the other lines represent the ETS cap. The carbon prices reflect what I mentioned before about the solution to the surplus and excess allocation in the EU ETS once it was finally solved, and once the EU had adopted its 2050 net zero target, everybody knew that the ETS cap by 2030 would be much more ambitious. So the carbon prices jumped up to hit $100 per ton towards the end of last year because of the expectation of the limited supply in the market. And the key message is that the high carbon prices are really able to drive large-scale decarbonisation options like green hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and other technologies. So I guess the EU ETS works in two ways. In one way, it works through the carbon price. The carbon price is an incentive for companies to reduce their GHG emissions through their operational and their investment decisions. The other way in which the ETS works, and I'll be coming to this later, is through support for investment. So the ETS generates a huge amount of revenue through auction recycling, and it also generates revenue to support innovation fund. So there's two important mechanisms by which the EU ETS can drive GHG reductions. The power sector is the kind of success story so far of EU ETS. It has really resulted in quite significant reductions in power sector emissions. So what this slide is showing is an example of the merit order of how power stations are introduced into the grid. This is a German company with information from 2018 and 2019. So effectively, with the way in which the electricity market works in the EU, the carbon price is influencing dispatch decisions, and on the left, in the dark brown and grey, you've got lignite and coal, which are used very widely because they're cheap in Germany. But when the carbon price increased from 2018 to 2019, the lignite and coal was pushed to the right-hand side of the chart, and gas, which is yellow, came to the left-hand side. That meant that the merit order enabled low-carbon power generation technologies to be prioritized. And there was, I think, a 40 million ton reduction just in 1 year alone in Germany because of the ETS. Clearly, energy prices change, and this picture now is different, but the message is that merit order needs to be impacted by the carbon price to drive power sector reductions. And I'll come on to that in terms of lessons for Korea and other countries. The industrial sector story is a bit different. I guess the big improvements and the big reductions are going to happen after 2030. But before 2030, there are going to be some significant developments. And the way in which the ETS has a long-term policy certainty, the way in which people have confidence in the policy and the carbon price to 2030, combined with the availability of funds through innovation fund, auction revenue, is a big motivator for industry to decarbonize. So, for example, in the steel industry, by 2030, it's estimated that 30% of EU primary steel production will be decarbonized using green hydrogen. And one example is Salzgitter Steel in Germany. By 2025, they plan to introduce the first green hydrogen electric arc furnace to replace their blast furnace. That will reduce their emissions by 30%. By 2030, they will do another change to get 50% reduction. By 2035, they will have 95% reduction in GHG emissions through the transition from blast furnace to DRI with EAF. In the chemical sector, there's a perhaps more complex mixture of abatement technologies like cracker furnace redesign, electrification of crackers, hydrogen furnaces, biomass, CCS, etc. One example is BASF, which is planning by next year to have electrically heated steam cracker, and its Antwerp site is planning to be net zero by 2030. And then in the cement industry, there is a huge amount of investment in carbon capture and utilization, with a lot of demonstration projects going on, and big switches to alternative fuels, reduction in clinker share, etc. And there's a lot of information available on the EU Industry Association websites of best practice case studies. So I really encourage you to have a look at CEFIC, SEMBureau, Eurofair websites, and so on. I guess the key element of the EU ETS is the cap, and the 2030 ambition of 55% reduction in GHG versus 1990 is cascades down in the EU target setting methodology into a burden for the ETS sectors and then the non-ETS sectors. So what this means is that for ETS sectors, through the modeling of cost-effective compliance, they get 61% reduction in GHG by 2030 from 2005 reference period. Non-ETS sectors get 40% reduction. This is reflecting more cost-effective abatement in power and industry sectors. So the EU ETS is a key instrument for the EU to achieve their goal of GHG reduction, and it plays a central role in the Fit for 55 package. And I think that's also true in Korea, how the KETS can play this central role in providing assurance. And in fact, in Korea, the coverage of the KETS is much bigger than the EU. EU ETS covers about 40% of GHG, whereas in Korea it's over 70%. But this chart is quite significant because it shows the linear reduction factor. And to convert from the old phase 4 target, which was 43% reduction by 2030, that is now 61% reduction. So the linear reduction factor, every year, the cap drops by, will now drop by 4.2% every year from 2024, whereas the previous linear reduction factor was 2.2%. And this chart actually shows, if you look at 2020 on the left and 2030 on the right, there's approximately 50% reduction in GHG emissions over this time period. It was really interesting to think about how the EU were able to implement this tighter cap, and surprisingly, they didn't have much resistance from industry, and this is primarily through transparent decision-making, a systematic methodology, an open economic model that everybody knew the assumptions and the data, and effective stakeholder engagement. And I think it's also important to combine this with carbon leakage mitigation measures, which are there to protect industry from competitive disadvantage, so Cbam and free allocation, etc., which I'll come on to. In terms of the free allocation is not major changes in this. Primarily, free allocation, as you're probably familiar, is based on benchmarks that are based on average of top 10% performance, which is already very ambitious. These are updated now based on latest data. There's different time periods for that. The carbon leakage factor is broadly similar, so factor of 1.0 if you're trade intense and emissions intense, 0.3 if you're not. There is some better targeting, so the reduction in the benchmarks can be more ambitious now. And then there's also broadening of the scope to ensure no disadvantage for green hydrogen, for example, or low carbon steel. There's some conditionality, so if a company is not implementing energy efficiency measures, then it will have a 25% reduction in free allocation. I guess the big thing is, and I guess the following presentation is Cbam, so I'm not going to talk much about that, but in terms of free allocation for sectors covered by the Cbam, then their free allocation will drop by 10 percentage points from 2026 down to 0 by 2035. And then that free allocation that they would have got is going to be sent to the Innovation Fund to provide funds for investment. There's also a phase out of free allocation for aviation. In terms of the scope, there are some significant changes because the EU realizes that their reductions have been most effective for ETS sectors, and they've been least effective for non-ETS sectors. So there's been a drive to bring more sectors into the ETS. So maritime transport is now in. They've been doing MRV for maritime for a while, so I guess it was relatively straightforward. Rather than free allocation, there's a phase-in period of allowance surrendering for maritime. This is basically ships traveling within the EU and 50% of emissions of voyages from EU to non-EU countries. Significantly, buildings and transport are two sectors where emissions have actually gone up in the EU. So they've decided, or they're planning to have a new ETS for buildings and transport. You may be familiar in Germany, there's an ETS for heating and transport fuels. This is a similar kind of upstream ETS that regulates energy suppliers. Also, California has an upstream ETS for transport fuel suppliers. So this will be seeking to decarbonize these sectors more ambitiously. There'll be full auctioning because entities can pass through their costs. There'll also be a social climate fund, so 25% of the revenue will be used to support vulnerable households or other vulnerable groups. I guess in the case of Korea, there's already transport and buildings included in the scope through the simple definition of inclusion based on 125,000 tons a year if you're an entity, or 25,000 tons a year if you're an installation, regardless of the sector. So in some ways, the Korean ETS is a good system. It's very simple, and it doesn't exclude any sector like the EU does. That's partly because of the indirect emissions allocation and how electricity is included in the KETS. But there may be some other opportunities for the KETS to expand its scope, which I'll come to later. The next point is on auction revenue recycling. So, as you're probably familiar, in the EU, all of the power sector is auctioned allowances, because they can pass through their carbon cost to electricity prices, and they really don't worry at all about the carbon cost. So 57% of allowances are auctioned, and what's happened is that as the carbon price has gone up, the amount of revenue has really gone through the roof. So in the EU, since auction revenue was collected, there's now been $118 billion of revenue collected through auction revenue. That's a significant amount. That's more than double the amount of money the Korean government is putting into the Green New Deal, for example. This money is being used by member states for multiple purposes, primarily climate. In the future, they'll have to use all of it for climate and energy, as well as social purposes. But most of the revenue, in fact, half of the revenue for the EU has come through the last 2 years, because it's linked to this jump in the carbon price. Once they've got the system working, with the MSR, they solved the problem of the surplus of allowances, the carbon price jumped up, and then this huge amount of money is critical to support low-carbon transformation. And if you look at this chart on the right, this is from the ICAP Emissions Trading Worldwide ICAP Status Report 2022. Highly recommend this reference. It gives so much useful information. There's a chart here, maybe a bit difficult to see, but it shows the EU has generated $118 billion of auction revenue. California has collected $18 billion. Korea has collected less than $1 billion. That's because in the KETS, auctioning is only up to 10%, and the carbon price is relatively low. So these are the big opportunities to support. If you think about how industry in Europe is really accelerating with its investment plans for decarbonisation, it's partly because they can get money through the EU ETS. The Innovation Fund is the other mechanism. So this is, I guess it's relatively well known, the Innovation Fund. It's under continual improvement. They've increased the amount of the size of the fund. So it's 450 to 650 million. It's gone up to 650 million EU allowances. So it's tens of billions of euros. So this fund is awarded through project applications, primarily through helping technology become commercialized, to bring to the market decarbonisation solutions. So, as I mentioned, the allowances that would have been freely allocated to Cbam sectors are now going to be auctioned, and the auction revenue is going to go to the Innovation Fund. Interestingly, one of the significant improvements to the Innovation Fund is the use of carbon contracts for difference methodology, which reduces the risks to investors in projects where normally you think the carbon price is quite volatile, it's going up and down all the time, but carbon contracts for difference provide some security on the carbon price for projects, and it brings down the real cost of projects significantly. In fact, in Germany, they've got a separate carbon contracts for difference policy just for industrial innovation. And then the last slide here is really lessons for an ETS, because why are we talking about the EU ETS so much? What does it mean to any other jurisdiction? EU is not the same as Korea. EU, the problems and solutions are different, but there are some important lessons. I think the first one is to develop the ETS cap in line with the national GHG reduction target. So we know Korea has the 40% reduction NDC by 2030. The KETS already has a methodology to align the KETS cap to the national target. So that methodology should be applied appropriately to ensure that the KETS cap is consistent with a tighter 2030 NDC. That will have a significant difference on the carbon price. Ensure a broad sectoral coverage. So KETS already has a broad coverage. It might reduce once the carbon cost is passed through to electricity prices and indirect emissions may no longer need to be allocated, the scope might reduce. But the question is, should transport fuels be included? For example, should there be an upstream fuel distribution inclusion, for example? And then should the thresholds be reduced for certain sectors like buildings? Introduce full auctioning. So we know that this year the environmental merit order is due to be implemented in Korea so that the carbon cost can be included in the variable operating cost of power stations, which will be a great improvement and a great breakthrough. And also that the carbon cost can be passed through to retail electricity prices, although there is a limit on that, the extent to which that can happen. But once that can happen, full auctioning to the power sector can happen. There might be concerns about high electricity prices, but the revenue can be used to protect vulnerable industry and vulnerable households. There should be a fund that can be used in a very targeted way to support the transition to net zero from key sectors that need this finance, steel industry, chemical industry, etc. There can be lessons from the Innovation Fund, from the EU, lessons from Germany, lessons from the US with their loan program, for example. There should be ambitious benchmarks. We know that there's fairly generous allocation based on weighted average benchmarks, but should that be more ambitious? Should it be a certain percentage below that, like in California, where it's 10% below the average? EU is top 10%. There should be rule-based market stability measures. There's some very effective market stability measures in California based on controlling the price with price ceilings and price thresholds. And then this provides certainty to the market. The benefit of this is it makes the job of MOE and much easier. They don't have to intervene manually. The market is more predictable, just like in the EU and just like in California. And then liquidity is also another issue. I think this is gradually improving, but there needs to be perhaps more third-party participants and more, through regulating and protecting against market abuse, then this can also happen. I think the market needs to work properly with a tight cap, with high level of auctioning, generating huge amounts of revenue to drive the investment needed for carbon neutrality. So I think there's some good lessons here from the EU, and Korea's made great progress with the KETS. I guess it's now just refining certain design choices around the KETS to turn it into a really powerful tool to support decarbonisation in Korea. But also this is relevant just as much to Indonesia, in India, China, Vietnam, Thailand. There's lots of other countries developing their similar policies. So thank you very much for listening, and that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Allister Ritchie, once again for that wonderful presentation. We will continue on with our next presentation. And for that, I'd like to invite onto the podium Mr. Jonathan Woodland, Head of Climate Diplomacy at the British Embassy, Seoul, onto the podium. So please greet him with a warm round of applause. Mr. Jonathan Woodland began his career with the UK Ministry of Justice back in 2009 and has held roles in both the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. His presentation today is on mitigating the risk of carbon leakage. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So my sincere appreciation to President Hong-Gun So of the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Research Centre of Korea for his invitation for me to speak here today. The first step in responding to the climate crisis is understanding the scale of the challenge and the scientific basis to inform our response. So thank you to President So and his team for the critical role they play in this regard. I'm delighted to be here today to address the nature of the current debate on how countries should respond to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage. In this regard, the UK is working hard to build international consensus for, firstly, ambitious action on mitigating carbon emissions, and secondly, the use of policies such as carbon pricing to ensure that incentives in the private sector are aligned with domestic and international efforts to decarbonise. I must stress at the outset that the UK decision-making in how best to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage through policy or through a package of future policies is firmly in the development stage. We are currently reviewing options and taking on board evidence through public consultation. So whilst there are no definitive answers I can provide today on how the UK's final approach will look, I'll aim to provide some insight into how the UK is approaching the issue of carbon leakage. Various estimates indicate that 20 to 30% of global CO2 emissions are connected to international trade in one form or another. Many developed countries are net importers of trade-embodied emissions, a feature of the gradual shift of manufacturing to rapidly industrializing countries and the associated transition to a service-dominated economy in many high-income countries. So it's worth stating up front that as the UK looks at the carbon leakage challenge, we define this as a displacement driven, as per the slide says, by specific factors such as carbon pricing and climate regulation, rather than alternative determinants of displacement, for example, access to labour, capital, raw materials, which sit outside this broad definition. As things stand, the UK appraises that there is limited evidence of carbon leakage occurring in the UK right now, but that we expect the risk to increase significantly this decade for reasons I'll go on to discuss. Whilst we are still deciding our approach on specific policy actions to take to limit carbon leakage, we are set on our approach to driving ambitious global action on mitigation. The UK is leading global calls to achieve emission reduction trajectories of 45% cuts by 2030 on a 2010 baseline, a level of cuts which the IPCC advises is required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Ahead of COP26 last year, the UK worked with all parties to strengthen ambition. And by making COP26 the most inclusive COP ever, we brought in key non-state actors, using the opportunity presented by Glasgow to accelerate engagement on issues such as in industrial decarbonisation. In the aftermath of COP26, Somewhere in the region of 90% of the global economy is covered by net zero commitments. Many of the biggest emitters, including the G7, Korea, and in recent weeks Australia, have significantly enhanced their NDCs. Yet, as the UNFCCC have recognised, globally NDCs are at present insufficiently ambitious to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as the chart in the slide shows, there is a worrying dissonance between NDCs and the actual policies in key sectors such as power, transport, industry, to actually reduce the emissions. At the optimistic end of the spectrum, we're looking at scenarios where we can limit warming to 1.5, but there is real concern that we may be facing an off-ramp in excess of 2 degrees Celsius, unless emitters everywhere, but especially the biggest developed emitters, take greater action. Warming in excess of 2 degrees Celsius is, as we know, potentially catastrophic. And that's why the Glasgow Climate Pact asked all countries, including Korea, to review and improve their NDC ambition in 2022, strengthening sectoral transition plans, for example in transport, power or industry, if, as in many cases, it's actually impossible to increase the top-line NDC ambition. And the UK is following the same trajectory at the moment. We're looking at our own NDC and deciding how we can improve and strengthen, and if that's possible in this year of 2022. So it is the firm contention of the UK that international problems are addressed by international solutions, and climate is the ultimate international problem. That's why our starting point is that we want sufficient numbers of countries to take action which mitigates greenhouse gas emissions at a similar rate in given sectors, thereby reducing carbon leakage risk for all. So the first step, and one that we've encouraged through multiple channels, but not least our G7 presidency in 2021, is to encourage our trading partners to ambitiously mitigate emissions in coordination with one another, whilst taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities. To date, the UK has made solid progress in meeting its own mitigation targets. Our commitment to reduce domestic emissions by 68% by 2030 on a 1990 baseline is broadly on track. As of 2021, we've achieved a 47% reduction in emissions. The UK's Climate Change Committee, which reports annually to Parliament and holds the government to account in the delivery of its emission reduction commitments, has highlighted a number of praiseworthy areas of delivery. So this includes the rollout of renewable energy, enabled by a combination of cost reductions over the last decade and an effective policy framework. The UK can now celebrate 50 gigawatts of renewable energy connected to the grid, up from 9 gigawatts in 2010, with approximately a further 45 gigawatts either under construction or where planning has been submitted or approved. On the back of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our energy security strategy has shifted to an even more ambitious low-carbon posture, with even greater ambition on renewable rollout by 2030, combined with massive investment planned in civil nuclear, with an aim of 24 gigawatts by 2050, which is 3 times more than at present, and a doubling of hydrogen production to 10 gigawatts by 2030. These are some of the highlights of the recent strategy. The Climate Change Committee also acknowledges that the UK's positive take-up of electric cars, efforts to reduce the intensity of energy in the industrial sector, and efforts to increase energy efficiency of the steel sector have been effective, as have measures to reduce emissions connected to meat consumption. But there is a huge amount more to be done in order to achieve our NDC. In the UK, were we to use 2021 as a baseline year, we still need to make approximately 40% emissions reductions by 2030 in order to achieve the NDC. We aim to achieve this with support and advice of stakeholders from across the economy. Business is crucial, and the advice of academics and other stakeholders is incredibly valuable in this regard. As we look at the attached chart, we can see kind of an evaluation based on current policy and implementation plans. So overall, we need to follow the line of reductions at the bottom of the chart, but green indicates an estimation of where the Climate Change Committee believes we have credible plans to achieve emissions reductions. Yellow indicates plans where there are some risks, and orange where there are significant risks. Red denotes areas where there are just insufficient plans in place. So whilst forward-looking plans to roll out clean energy and zero-emission vehicles hold promise, the Climate Change Committee have significant concern in the government's plans to improve energy efficiency, to deploy electric heat pumps in homes, to make progress in low-carbon farming, to advance woodland restoration, and to roll out industrial CCS project pipelines. The government is now in the process of responding to the Climate Change Committee's recommendations and to strengthening delivery plans. I add this UK story for context, firstly because I was asked to by the organisers, but secondly because it helpfully frames how the UK may choose to respond to the risk of carbon leakage. Countries globally are to a greater or lesser extent now thankfully moving on a path to decarbonisation and we hope, as science demands, mid-century net zero. But much of this shift to net zero is happening at an uneven pace. The UK needs to maintain its ambitious trajectory whilst ensuring that our industries are not unduly penalised for investing in the transition at a pace which science tells us is required to limit warming to 1.5. Having the right policy measures in place is critical to achieving this, because we can expect the risk of carbon leakage to increase in the mid-2020s, as industries not only adjust their business models to meet net zero, but as the carbon price remains on a broadly upward trajectory. In a UK context, the leakage risk increases further as the decade progresses, and the UK implements the policies to deliver its most ambitious sixth carbon budget for 2033 to 37. During that 4-year period, will be critical to deliver our overall 78% emission reduction targets, which we've already set for 2035. Industry is already advising the UK government that the risk of carbon leakage is leading to investment hesitancy right now, and we therefore need to be prepared to ensure net zero remains on track. The UK is not alone, I think it's fair to say, in this effort or within this concern, and that's why internationally the response to carbon leakage is occupying increasing profile and bandwidth in multilateral settings. In this critical decade for action, calls from a growing number of countries are for an inclusive multilateral response to carbon leakage. So I've listed in a slide a number of the key components of what are emerging as key aspects of a strengthened international climate architecture. Many of these are critically at the point where trade and climate converge, and that's why they're increasingly becoming important multilateral issues. I'm sure in addition to those listed that I may have missed off a number of other really important and valuable platforms. The UK is at the stage of engaging with all of these proposals put forward, but we do not have positions necessarily yet on all of them. This is a dynamic field where much thinking and much work still needs to be done. So this is just but what I think is probably helpful is now if I provide a summary of the overarching aims of each platforms to give you a sense of how the issue of carbon leakage is debated and being discussed. So the OECD's Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches is exploring how climate policies compare on emissions reductions to improve global understanding of the comparability of policy stringency and to improve global dialogue and decision-making. The Climate Club is a German proposal covering a range of aspects, but emissions measurement, carbon pricing, carbon leakage, R&D, and sector decarbonisation are really important themes. The G7 is engaged on the benefits of carbon pricing, the measurement of embodied emissions, and assessing carbon price equivalents. The links between climate and trade, the industrial decarbonisation agenda, all continue to be promoted through dialogue in the G7 on all these issues. Carbon pricing is also being discussed in the G20 to ensure an approach which is being built which works for the broadest range of countries, those developed and developing economies. The IMF's International Carbon Price Floor proposes a single common carbon price internationally, differentiated by income level, whilst the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions Group is working to advance the WTO's Trade and Environment Work Plan. Elsewhere, we have the Breakthrough Agenda process, the G7 Industrial Decarbonisation Agenda, the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial, all broadly aiming to create market demand for low-carbon industrial materials such as steel, cement, work on the harmonisation of embodied emissions, reporting and standard setting. Combined, they aim to drive a greater demand for green industrial goods through setting shared targets for low-carbon public procurement. Whilst recognising that different countries will take different approaches to climate regulation and economy-wide decarbonisation, we are, through the initiatives set out here, seeing a broad shift to a stronger multilateral effort to mitigate the risk of climate leakage. That brings me to say some final words on the UK and the next steps we're taking in this critical decade. As we transition to net zero, the UK recognises the importance of addressing the risk of carbon leakage to ensure that our ambitious policy on decarbonisation is not undermined. As I've suggested already, the best way to do this would be for either countries to firstly decarbonise at a broadly commensurate pace, or secondly, for all countries to move together in pricing and regulating emissions. This type of international solution is possible, but can take time to develop. So we need to consider domestic options, and these have to be targeted and proportionate for certain sectors. At present, 3 allowances under the UK emissions trading scheme are our main form of carbon leakage mitigation. In the UK and beyond, one of the criticisms of free allocations is that they have dampened incentives to ramp up modernisation and decarbonisation in industry. So to meet the challenge of 2050 net zero, we must align the UK ETS with a net zero trajectory, and the future free allocation policy is being considered as part of this. As things stand, we're working on a net zero consistent ETS at the moment, and that's a project which is ongoing and will hopefully produce some results soon. We are also considering alternative mechanisms, and yes, this does include a carbon border adjustment mechanism, highlighted, as per the slide, in the UK's net zero strategy, which was announced in 2021. A consultation on the UK approach to a Cbam is underway as we speak, to ensure we secure the feedback of stakeholders, both domestically and internationally. Alongside free allowances and Cbams, consideration is also being given to policies which would grow the market for low-emission industrial products, such as product standards, labelling and procurement measures, and these will be considered as part of a much wider package. But let me be clear, this does not mean that a UK Cbam will necessarily be implemented in the future. Any policy or combination of policies in this space will balance a range of priorities for the UK, both domestically and internationally, and decisions are yet to be taken. So to conclude, in what has been a fairly swift review of quite a large amount of ground, I hope I've been able to set the scene for how and why the UK is looking to mitigate carbon leakage. What I think is worth taking away from this discussion is the understanding that debate on how to mitigate carbon leakage is emerging as a priority for a number of countries. This will continue to be a significant factor in multilateral fora for some time to come. The drive to avert leakage is driven by a desire from countries such as the UK to achieve net zero and to ensure the right incentives are in place for businesses seeking to decarbonise. All the time ensuring that domestic emissions reductions aren't simply shifted elsewhere and replaced by an increase in consumption emissions, none of which will help us achieve Paris targets. It is very much in the interests of all countries to deepen engagement in this space. as disciplines converge, in this case climate and trade policy, there will inevitably be different approaches and understandings on the issue. Today, I've presented much of this through the lens of how we tackle the climate crisis. But the UK absolutely wishes to focus on a coordinated international response to address carbon leakage in order to avoid new barriers to trade or disputes. I look forward to following up with counterparts here and elsewhere wishing to discuss this matter further in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Jonathan Woodland, Head of Climate Diplomacy from the British Embassy Seoul. Please give him another big round of applause. And that brings us to the third and final presentation for today. The title of that one will be The Evolution of Sustainability Disclosure. For this, please welcome onto the stage Mr. Mark Watson. Mr. Watson is the country managing partner of ERMkorea, and he has over 35 years of experience in the fields of ESG, sustainability, and environment management. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. 안녕하세요. Investors, governments, and the wider community expect, expect businesses and industry to be able to understand, to be able to measure, and to be able to disclose their ESG, sustainability, and climate-related performances. That has been a journey over many, many years, and I would like to share some of my insights, I guess, and learnings about that journey and what it perhaps tells us about the future. I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to speak here today. Very briefly about ERM, we're the world's largest pure-play sustainability consultancy. We have about 7,500 people across the world in 170 offices in 40 countries. About the Sustainability Institute, it's our own forum on which we aim to drive the businesses and business performance through better information. And I'd like to acknowledge our Sustainability Institute for some of the contributions to my presentation today. Very quickly, I wish to give a quick overview, I guess, of where we've come from over many years, where we are in terms of disclosure today, and perhaps a brief look into the future and what that might mean. Bear with me, I guess I'm going to use ESG, sustainability, and climate-related issues interchangeably. I know they're not, but for the ease of presentation, perhaps bear with me on that one. So we have been on quite a journey, and it started probably well before this slide indicates, but we've gone through a range of eras, I guess, starting with the regulatory era, where information about, I guess, impacts that businesses and industry had on the environment was regulated. Clean air in particular was one of the first to get regulated in many places around the world. And from regulation we moved to policy, to guidance, and that was both on an independent jurisdiction level, but also more broadly at regional and global levels. But that wasn't enough, and we saw increasing activism in a range of areas, but particularly, and I guess most notably in regard to climate, with local NGOs and international organisations being vocal about the need for change and the need for improvement in our performance as a business, as an industry, and as a community. I think what we've seen over recent years, though, is a move from those having influence outside of the organisations, whether that be government or activists, to moves kind of within the organisations where stakeholders, shareholders, investors have had a say in how companies should perform. And that performance needs to be measured. I guess I'll come back to this quite a few times. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so we've seen us, I guess, move towards an era where sustainability, ESG issues, climate-related matters have been integrated into business performance as part of the overall governance and operations of a business, and that has provided ownership and provides, I think, some hope to improvement rather than a responsive approach, which had certainly been in the past. And we're now looking towards, I guess, transformation. So that drive from just not doing things better, but perhaps doing things differently. And I think one of the areas that we're particularly seeing that is in the transformation in many of the large multinational oil companies around the world who, for many years, were in the extraction of oil and gas and its transport, and far more their portfolio of operations is including renewables. And I think this is a great thing. So we have been on quite a journey, and there's become an evolution of this alphabet soup almost of guidelines and frameworks and standards and disclosures. It probably started again way before this slide indicates, but some of the early pieces of work by the OECD in capturing environment in along with economic requirements, the fundamental, I guess, definition of what sustainability was back in the mid-80s with the Brundtland Report, and then this evolution of guidances on how we capture things, how we measure things, how we should record our performance. There have been organisations, both private and government-related, that have set out to instruct, coach, and encourage industry to be more transparent, to be more consistent. But that hasn't been coordinated. And what has happened has been this evolution of standards and guidance that makes life fairly difficult for businesses to react to respond to, and to perform against. A couple of things, I guess, in particular I wanted to kind of draw attention to on this slide, and one is the TCFD, so the Task Force for Financial Disclosure, climate-related financial disclosure. Formed in 2015, their benchmark reports released in 2017 kind of set the most broadly, I believe, accepted framework within which we can operate. And things that have followed have largely based themselves around that. We've seen most recently in March and April of this year 3 quite important pieces of policy and documentation released, and I'll discuss those in a minute, but they relate to the IFRS, the SEC, and the International Standards Board. But very quickly on TCFD. So Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as I said, established in 2017. The aim really was to help to provide some guidance to industry really and to companies, to collect and to utilise information in a way that would enable more informed use of that capital in a more appropriate and sustainable way. There were 4 thematic themes, as you can see on the slide there, and there were 11 climate-related recommendations, which, whilst there has been some evolution even within TCFD since then, have largely stood the test of the last few years, and as I said, form the basis of what much has followed. But the whole sustainability, particularly ESG ecosystem, is really quite complicated. So it's made up of a range of organisations that do different things. So those in the top right corner there that kind of set some frameworks for how data should be collected and managed, how performance should take place, some objectives, some targets, etc. The bottom right, those organisations that actively request information and collect and collate that information. In the middle there, those groups like Bloomberg and MSCI that more passively collect data, trawl the internet, look at reports that are tabled at stock exchanges around the world and disclosures that companies make themselves, and collect and collate and compare. And then those that actually purchase data and end up with rankings and ratings, so the top 100 this and the best 50 that's. So some very different approaches and some very different ways of really trying to achieve the same end, and that is to help businesses be more transparent and therefore more accountable, and to help investors to make more wise and informed decisions, and in so doing help to transform business and industry into a better future. With all this collation of different sets of standards and guidelines, frameworks, etc., it's very difficult to operate. We advise companies all around the world, and I guess as we said, most of the Fortune 500s, or at least over half of them. And it's challenging, right, to know where to go and what to do. As we see here, that the International Organization of Securities Commission called last year for a move towards harmonization. I'm not sure that's exactly happening, but we are getting better. So, as I said, in the last, I guess in April and March March and April of this year, there were three quite important pieces of work released for comment. The last of which, I guess, closed for comment only this week. One by the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the European Financial and Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, and the International Finance Reporting Standards, so IFRS. So one with a US focus, one with an EU focus, and one with an international focus of setting some benchmark standards. I might just bring it down so I can see the screen a little bit. As you can see, the first one released by the SEC requires that all companies that file with the SEC report their climate-related emissions. Within the EU, there was guidance issued on a broad range of sustainability-related disclosures. And at the international standards level, that included very detailed climate-related standards. All of them roughly and broadly are based on TCFD and are consistent with it. SEC uses its own approach for disclosure and its own approach to some metrics and targets. ISSB, in terms of the standards, presents additional requirements over and above TCFD, and the ESRS is perhaps the most prescriptive, and whilst it aligns with TCFD guidelines, it significantly adds some more detail. So in the context of creating more harmonisation, there is some consistency, but we're still kind of creating different sets of guidelines and goals. In regards to emissions disclosures, all of them follow the TCFD guidelines. Thankfully, we use the same terminology and protocols for how we refer to Scope 1, 2, 3 and the methodologies associated with them. All call for mandatory reporting of Scopes 1 and 2, and Scope 3 gets a different bit of treatment depending on the size of the organisation and emissions and commitments made by companies, particularly in the US. In Korea, I think the important thing, and I guess from the earlier two presentations as well, what we've seen is what happens internationally is very important. We are, climate is the single, unique and common issue facing every nation. And so our approach to managing impacts on our climate and as a result of impacts to us as a result of climate change allows us to look beyond our own borders and to learn from other jurisdictions, and I think that's important. So here in Korea, I guess there's a very similar ecosystem and arrangement of requirements. So there's some drivers, there's some requirements for companies to implement data collection and disclosure. They might come from the stock exchange, if they're a member of PRI, etc. There's some targets, and we've largely followed international standards, science-based targets, and the RE100 related to energy uses. There's some requirements for us to assess in a similar and consistent way. The KCSG requirements for those who are listed on the stock exchange, and some international standards as well. So requirements to do some things, requirements to set some targets, requirements to assess, and then the requirements to disclose. We would have seen recently that the Korean Stock Exchange has committed to releasing its own guidance on disclosure. So yet another set of rules in that ecosystem. But a commitment is there to base it both on TCSD, but also on the three documents that I have just spoken about. So we'll see, and that's due for release in 2025. Disclosure requirements are increasing here and will be mandatory depending on the size of the organisation in terms of capital size of the organisation. And we can see here from the slide that the timetable over which that is proposed to occur for those that are listed on COPC. I think what's interesting and what's valuable here is Korea, like in many other jurisdictions, the alignment of normal financial reporting, governance reporting, along with sustainability and ESG reporting in a more common framework, not a separate issue, not something else for a company to deal with and to think about, but to be integrated into their day-to-day business and therefore their reporting to their shareholders and to the market in general. And I think that's quite important. I've moved through my speech fairly quickly, so I'll come to my last slide, and I guess there's a few takeaways that I wanted to share in regard to this journey that as a community, as an industry, that we've been on. Sustainability, ESG, carbon emissions, and disclosures are related to them. Will continue to evolve. How we do it, the data we collect, when we collect it, the level of detail we collect it, the methods we use, how we communicate that with our shareholders, our stakeholders, and the wider community will continue to evolve, and that's a good thing, right? And we'll get better at this. However, the benchmarks and the systems within which we do that, we have a way to go to have a simple and consistent framework within jurisdictions and around the world. And I think the opportunity, say for example for Korea through the stock exchange to set some guidance that builds on something else but has a Korean context, I think is an opportunity to get some alignment but some local focus, and it will be different. Everybody's will be different, but at least if we have some consistency of terminology, then that allows the application of different technologies and etc. to allow us to be more consistent. It's unclear whether methods used in one jurisdiction to record will be accepted by others. So I think there's a way to go with that. As we said earlier, I think that there's some very good lessons to be learnt. Many countries are on a different phase of their journey, and closely watching what is happening, participating wherever possible in the debate is very important for any nation, including South Korea. So the trends that happen have implications for how things will unfold here. Things will get tougher, so there will be an expansion, I think, of where we are. The type of data that is collected will get requirements to be more detailed, more explicit, more reliable, open to audit, and certainly I think we will see the requirements, the demands from the community at large and shareholders to actually count those Scope 3 emissions, so not your direct or indirect, but those that are associated with your supply chain, which is a very challenging area. But those demands will be greater, so the challenges for organisations will continue. So we should take note of what's happening elsewhere. And whilst we're developing our own forms, our own form of data management and collection and collation, we should take note of TCFD, because I think it does provide the broadest and most valuable framework, and I think we'll end up utilising that here for the disclosure. I guess, as I kind of said early on in the piece, disclosure is very important. It's important because it keeps companies honest. It enables us to assess our own performance and to have to stand up at a stock exchange or in front of our shareholders and declare our performance, and that drives improved performance, which is what we all want to see. And the data that backs that up is critical, because if you can't measure, you can't manage. So with that, I would like to say thank you, Kamsahamnida, and I look forward to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Watson, for sharing with us your insights on ESG and climate-related disclosure. That concludes the presentation session of the policy efforts being carried out by various governments, organizations, and institutions in order to achieve carbon neutrality. On behalf of all participants here today, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to all three presenters and their organizations and the institutions, governments that you represent for your continuous efforts. So everyone, please join me in extending another big round of applause to all three speakers, Mr. Allister Ritchie, Mr. Jonathan Woodland, and Mr. Mark Watson.